War demands sacrifices from countless souls. But what happens when those souls haven't even lived a decade or two on this earth? Today, we uncover the astonishing stories of two boys from opposite sides of the world who, through vastly different circumstances, became the unlikeliest of warriors during World War II. The Second World War engulfed nations across continents, conscripting millions into its merciless machinery. Yet among the ranks of uniformed soldiers stood two boys whose presence on the battlefield defied all convention, one from the Soviet Union, another from America. Their stories separated by thousands of miles but united by extraordinary courage. In the frozen hell of Stalingrad, 1942, a tiny figure in a hand-sewn uniform scurried between trenches, delivering messages while artillery shells exploded around him. His name was Sergei Ishk Kauf. He was just 6 years old, perhaps the youngest soldier of World War II. Sergei's journey into war began with unimaginable tragedy. In the small village of Grin, in Russia's Kaluga region, Nazi troops descended upon his home. For the crime of helping Soviet partisans, they executed his mother and brother before his eyes. At just 6 years old, Sergei fled into the vast Russian forest, where most children would have perished within days. What few know is that Sergei survived for nearly 2 weeks alone, subsisting on berries and roots, hiding in hollowed logs and taking shelter in abandoned animal dens. The winter was approaching, and temperatures had already fallen below freezing. By the time Soviet scouts from the 142nd Guards Rifle Regiment found him, his small body was covered in frostbite, and he was delirious from hunger. The soldiers couldn't believe their eyes. A child, barely alive, wandering through a war zone. They could have sent him to an orphanage far from the front. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Major Mikhail Vorobyov, the regiment's commander, saw something in the boy's eyes, a resilience, a quiet determination that mirrored the Soviet spirit itself. Against all military protocol, he formally adopted Sergei and made him a son of the regiment. The soldiers, hardened men who had witnessed the worst of humanity, embraced this child as their mascot, their lucky charm, their reminder of what they were fighting for. They fashioned him a uniform from scraps of military clothing, complete with a miniature belt and cap bearing the Soviet star. They even gave him a specially made pair of boots, perhaps the only military footwear in history sized for a first grader. What's remarkable is that Sergei wasn't merely a mascot. He became a functioning member of the unit. Too small to carry a rifle, he instead carried messages between command posts. Too young to understand strategy, he understood courage instinctively. Sergei's moment of greatest heroism came during the Battle of Stalingrad, the largest and bloodiest confrontation of World War II. On a bitter cold day in November 1942, an artillery shell struck the command dugout where Major Vorobyov, Sergei's adoptive father, was meeting with officers. The structure collapsed, burying everyone inside under tons of frozen earth and timber. What happened next defies explanation. 7-year-old Sergei, hearing the blast, ran not away from danger, but toward it. Witnesses describe him moving through artillery fire that had adult soldiers pinned down, his small size perhaps allowing him to navigate the battlefield in ways others couldn't. Reaching the sapper's position, Sergei didn't just report the collapse, he led the rescue team back through the bombardment, helping to locate the exact position where Vorobyov was buried. His knowledge of the command post layout proved crucial to finding survivors before oxygen ran out. For this extraordinary act, Sergei became the youngest recipient of the Soviet Medal for Courage in history. But perhaps more telling than the medal was the nickname his unit gave him after that day, the Little Owl, for his ability to see through darkness what others couldn't. What's seldom mentioned is that Sergei also helped identify German infiltrators on 3 separate occasions. His child's intuition and ability to spot details that adults missed may have saved hundreds of Soviet lives during critical moments of the Stalingrad campaign. The psychological toll of war manifested in Sergei in ways both visible and hidden. By age 7, he was smoking hand-rolled cigarettes, given to him by soldiers who thought nothing of it in an era when tobacco was considered medicinal. This habit, begun so young, contributed to the heart disease that would claim his life at just 53. What's rarely discussed is the nightmares that plagued Sergei throughout his life. According to those who knew him after the war, he would often wake screaming, reliving not just his mother's execution, but also scenes from Stalingrad. The constant shelling, the cries of wounded soldiers, the brutal winter that claimed as many lives as enemy bullets. Despite the trauma, Sergei found a path forward. After the war, Major Vorobyov officially adopted him, giving him the stability of family life. Sergei went on to study law, a choice perhaps influenced by his early exposure to war's lawlessness. He worked as a prosecutor in Chelyabinsk, married, and had children of his own, achievements that speak to his remarkable resilience. In the Soviet Union, Sergei was celebrated during the war as a symbol of national resistance, the son of the regiment who embodied Soviet determination against Nazi aggression. His image appeared in newspapers, and a special order from General Vasily Chuikov himself granted Sergei a personal Browning pistol, an extraordinary honor for a child. Yet after the war, as the Soviet system prioritized collective achievement over individual heroism, Sergei faded into relative obscurity. When he died of heart failure in 1990, just as the Soviet Union itself was collapsing, few remembered the child hero of Stalingrad. It wasn't until 2019, with the release of the film Soldier Boy, that his story was reintroduced to a new generation of Russians. What's particularly poignant is that Sergei died never knowing how unique his experience was in military history. In his mind, he was simply one of millions who had sacrificed for victory. This humility, whether natural or cultivated by Soviet society, speaks volumes about how differently heroism was framed behind the Iron Curtain. Now we turn to the other side of the world, where a very different child soldier was forging his path into military history. On the volcanic black sands of Iwo Jima, February 1945, a teenager hurled himself onto a live grenade to save his fellow Marines. His name was Jack Lucas, 17 years old and about to make a decision that would echo through military history forever. Unlike Sergei, who was thrust into war by tragedy, Jack Lucas charged toward it with reckless determination. His was not a story of circumstances, but of choice. A choice made far earlier than anyone would have expected. Born in Plymouth, North Carolina in 1928, Jack was raised on tales of American heroism. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, he was just 13, but something ignited inside him, a fire that couldn't be extinguished by rules or regulations. What few people realize is that Jack's journey to war began with an elaborate deception that showed maturity far beyond his years. After his father's death when he was just 10, Jack had grown into a powerfully built teenager who could easily pass for much older. Standing 5 feet 8 inches and weighing a solid 180 pounds at 14, he not only forged his mother's signature on enlistment papers, but crafted an entire false identity. He memorized adult mannerisms, deepened his voice during interviews, and even obtained falsified school records. When a notary public questioned his age, Jack didn't just offer a bribe. He presented a convincing story about needing to support his widowed mother through military service. The detail of his deception was astounding for a teenager. The Marines accepted him in August 1942. He was 14 years old, masquerading as 17, and about to receive training as one of America's elite warriors. But Jack's story takes an even more remarkable turn. When his actual age was discovered, he was assigned to drive trucks in Hawaii, safe duty, far from combat. For most underage soldiers, this would have been a relief. For Jack, it was unacceptable. In a move that defies belief, he stowed away on the USS Duel, bound for Iwo Jima, one of the bloodiest battlefields of the Pacific Campaign. He hid for days without food, knowing he'd face court-martial upon discovery. When finally found, instead of punishment, his boldness earned him assignment to a rifle company headed straight into combat. Jack's defining moment came on February 20th, 1945, just days after American forces landed on Iwo Jima. His unit was clearing a ravine when they encountered Japanese soldiers hidden in a trench. In the ensuing firefight, Jack's rifle jammed, a soldier's nightmare in close combat. It was then that he spotted 2 grenades landing in their position, just feet from his squad mates. In the fraction of a second most of us use to blink, Jack made a decision that defies human instinct. He shouted a warning, dove onto one grenade, and pulled the second beneath his body. The first grenade detonated. The blast lifted Jack's body and slammed it back to earth. By all medical understanding, he should have been killed instantly. By some miracle, perhaps the angle of his body or the soft volcanic sand absorbing some of the blast, he survived. The second grenade, remarkably, failed to detonate at all. What many don't know is that Jack remained conscious throughout the ordeal. As his fellow Marines stared in disbelief, he reportedly said, "Ain't nothing wrong with me that a little something to eat won't fix." This was despite having over 200 pieces of shrapnel in his body, including fragments that had penetrated his right lung, heart, and right arm. For this action, Jack became the youngest Medal of Honor recipient since the Civil War. President Truman, presenting the medal, remarked that he would rather have that honor than be president. High praise from the man who had ordered the atomic bombings that would end the war. Jack's survival after Iwo Jima seemed miraculous, but it came with a lifetime of pain. Over 21 surgeries removed hundreds of metal fragments from his body, though doctors decided some pieces too close to vital organs would remain with him forever. Literal pieces of war he would carry to his grave. What's particularly striking about Jack is how he channeled his experience. Unlike many traumatized veterans who sought escape through addiction or isolation, Jack seemed to develop an almost supernatural confidence. Having stared death in the face at 17, what else could frighten him? This manifested in remarkable ways. At age 33, having already survived what should have been certain death, Jack joined the Army's airborne forces and became a paratrooper. Not content with one brush with mortality, he sought the rush of jumping from perfectly functional aircraft. He earned his wings after completing training alongside men half his age. Perhaps most telling was Jack's response when asked if he regretted his action on Iwo Jima, given the lifetime of pain it caused him. "I'd do it again if I had to. No doubt in my mind, I'd do it over again." Unlike Sergei's quiet post-war life, Jack embraced his status as a living legend. He authored a memoir titled Indestructible, gave countless speeches to school children and military cadets, and became a successful businessman. When he died in 2008 at age 80, the Marine Corps rendered full honors, and the Secretary of the Navy announced that a destroyer would be named USS Jack H. Lucas. Jack's American story followed a dramatically different arc from Sergei's. His Medal of Honor made him an instant celebrity. He appeared in newspapers, in newsreels, and even starred in a documentary about his life. When he returned home to North Carolina, the governor declared a special Jack Lucas Day in his honor. Now that we've traced the remarkable journeys of these two child soldiers, let's examine what their parallel stories reveal about the nations they served and the times they lived in. Sergei and Jack, separated by language, culture, and ideology, nonetheless embodied something universal: the capacity for extraordinary courage regardless of age. Yet how their stories unfolded after their moments of heroism tells us much about the Soviet Union and America during and after the war. In the Soviet system, Sergei was celebrated as a symbol, not as an individual. His image represented collective resistance against fascism, a child who, like the Soviet nation itself, had been viciously attacked but refused to surrender. After the war, when individual recognition became less politically valuable, his story was allowed to fade. The America that welcomed Jack home, by contrast, thrived on individual heroism. His face on newspaper covers, his handshake with the president, his name eventually adorning a warship, all reflected a nation that celebrated exceptional individuals as embodiments of its values. There's a photograph of Sergei taken during the Battle of Stalingrad. He stands at attention in his miniature uniform, his face solemn beyond his years. His eyes hold something that shouldn't exist in a child: the 1,000-yard stare of a veteran who has seen too much. Similarly, in photos of Jack receiving his Medal of Honor, he appears simultaneously boyish and ancient. His smooth face contrasts sharply with eyes that had witnessed the worst of humanity at Iwo Jima's black volcanic beaches. The contrast is striking. One child soldier faded into history, while another was elevated to the pantheon of national heroes. Different systems, different values, different ways of processing the uncomfortable reality that children fought in their wars. What makes these stories resonate decades later isn't just their extraordinary nature. It's that they force us to confront uncomfortable truths about childhood, courage, and the brutal necessities of war. In today's world, we rightly condemn the use of child soldiers as a war crime. International conventions protect children from military service, yet Sergei and Jack remind us that in history's darkest hour, when civilization itself hung in the balance, age became irrelevant. Necessity demanded courage from everyone, even those whose lives had barely begun. These weren't the only child soldiers of World War II. Across Europe, the Hitler Youth were pressed into service as the Reich collapsed. In the Pacific, Japanese teenagers flew kamikaze missions. In China, children as young as 10 joined resistance fighters against Japanese occupation. But Sergei and Jack stand apart, not just for their youth, but for their extraordinary acts that transcended it. They remind us that heroism recognizes no minimum age requirement, that courage can come from the most unexpected sources, and that in war's crucible, the line between child and adult blurs into insignificance. As Jack Lucas once said, "You're never too young to fight for freedom," a sentiment Sergei Ishk Kauf lived, but in his Soviet context might never have been permitted to voice. One boy thrust into war by tragedy, another who charged toward it with determination, both forever changed by their experiences, both leaving legacies that continue to astonish. Two children who, in different ways and on opposite sides of the world, grew up too quickly in humanity's darkest hour. In their contrasting yet parallel stories, we find not just tales of remarkable courage, but a mirror reflecting our own complicated relationship with innocence, sacrifice, and the terrible price of freedom. This is the legacy of Sergei Ishk Kauf and Jack Lucas, children who became soldiers, boys who became legends, innocents who, when history demanded it, proved that heroism knows no age.